The process of constructing this series on slavery has forced me to do a lot of reflection on my chosen subject field of history, as well as the choices that I've made as a teacher. As I complete my preparation regarding the concept and institution of slavery within the societies of West Africa, it becomes clear that I'm only at the beginning of my excursion towards understanding this part of our historic legacy. But as Lao Tzu reminds us, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The events that have played out in 2020 have made clear that many of us around the world stopped and patted ourselves on the back for not being racist themselves and believed that the civilized world had arrived at the destination of a post-racial society. Anyone who studies history believes that understanding the past is key to understanding the present and making successful predictions for the future. But what if our understanding of the past is incomplete? You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This is the first of 4 episodes regarding the West African slave trade. Episode number 1, Social Death. In the 1700s, Hegel, the famous German philosopher, dismissed the continent that mankind likely originated from, proclaiming that Africa was not worth studying. To his trained mind, Africa was merely the land of our childhood, a land which exhibits man in its original wild and untamed state. For a philosopher whose work revolved around humanity's history, this dismissal of Africa is a damning shortcoming. Hegel lived during the era of the transatlantic slave trade, an era whose consequences are still being revealed to us today. His view of Africans as savages was a common trope among his contemporary Europeans, but widespread acceptance of an idea doesn't mean that it is right. Hegel's outright dismissal was echoed in the 1960s by Hugh Trevor Roper, a well-regarded British scholar who claimed that, quote, Africa has no history of its own, and whatever history it has is that of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness. Roper wrote this during the backdrop of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. His statement is not ancient history with its outdated preconceptions. Roper's home nation ended slavery in 1833, 130 years before Roper made himself a part of the story with his ignorant statement. The year that he made his pronouncement regarding the darkness of pre-colonial Africa included his fellow Englishman Paul Stephenson mimicking Rosa Parks and leading a boycott against an openly racist public bus company. That boycott concluded successfully on the same day that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial. The black and white images of the 1960s civil rights movement have a way of misleading today's students into thinking that these events were considerably further in the past than they actually were. This, in turn, further tricks us into believing that the racialized problems of the past were solved by previous generations. But 1963 was only 57 years ago. The generation that learned about the civil rights movement as a current events topic are now just reaching their mid-70s. Although social studies was just being included in the curriculum of American schools, the study of world history and therefore our understanding of the present that we live in has changed little. That makes many of us complicit in making Hegel and Roper's words reality. I will use my own experience with world history to illustrate my point. I enjoy African history, yet I have very little expertise with the subject. This is likely because of the curriculum that I was taught in the mid-1980s and 1990s. My teachers, for the most part, ignored the African continent, opting instead for a focus on European history. Most of the information about Africa that I was introduced to came in the form of physical and cultural geography. Some of this historical exclusion is justified by a focus on systems of writing. African societies did not customarily write down their history, or at least that is the common refrain. Instead, Africans focused on the practice of gurwis, a dedicated social class of storytellers who were responsible for passing down the history of their civilization through stories. These performers were renowned for their skill at spinning a tale and making history come alive in a way that few historical tomes can. For all their skill, however, historians view oral history with a healthy dose of skepticism. Stories can change with each telling, and they often involve mythological elements used by the storyteller as metaphors. This builds into a lazy argument for the exclusion of African history in our base curriculum. Egyptian hieroglyphics were not translated until Napoleon Bonaparte's forces invaded Egypt and discovered the Rosetta Stone. I find it hard to believe the scholars dismissed Egyptian history until the 1800s, just because we could not translate their writing system. For much of their time spent pillaging, the Mongols were an illiterate society. We do not write off the time before Genghis Khan's uniting of the Mongol kingdoms just because that history was passed down orally. Writing and primary documents are just one tool that historians use for understanding the past. In my own teaching, I have offered what I refer to as snapshots of African history between full units on European history. For instance, my students remain for weeks on ancient Greece and Rome before receiving some basic information on the kingdoms of Mali, Ghana, and Great Zimbabwe. We then return to Europe in time for the Middle Ages to begin. I've always justified this teaching by reminding myself that there is simply too much to teach and something needs to get left behind. The state standards mandate some of these choices. After all, Rome has its own set of 12 standards, while the African civilizations are vaguely mixed in as one or two standards within other units. The more that I think about this system, however, the more frustrated my previous decisions make me. Teaching Africa as an interlude to history prevents students from understanding the full context of the story, and from grasping Africa's significance within the global community. Howard French is one of the historians that is attempting to right the ship. His work, Born in Blackness, attempts to re-envision the history of the modern world by focusing on the African kingdoms of the moment rather than the Europeans. He does so by utilizing a mix of contemporary and modern-day sources, including Guillaume Thomas Francois de Renal, who described Europe's plantations worked by African slaves as the principal cause of the rapid motion which now agitates the universe. As well as Daniel Defoe, the English author of Robinson Crusoe, who bluntly stated, "No African trade, no blacks. No blacks, no sugars. No sugars, no islands, no continent. No continent, no trade." Columbus may have been the first modern man to cross the Atlantic Ocean, but he did so as a medieval man from a medieval world, surrounded by medieval notions about Cyclops, pygmies, Amazons, dog-faced natives, antipodeans who walk on their heads and think with their feet, about dark-skinned, giant-eared races who inhabit the lands where gold and precious gems grow. When he stepped onto American soil, however, he did more than enter a new world. He stepped into a new age. How did that age begin? What would it look like? Columbus's own journals provide us insight into the captain's thinking, as he calmly wrote that the locals would make excellent slaves. Clearly, centering history on European thought might leave us with some wrong ideas. When we jump from Rome to Mali, one sees an amazing civilization, one that any student would happily time travel back to and visit. But then we abruptly leave it, showing the kids that such a beautiful civilization was possible, but failing to teach how it developed to become that makes the story incomplete. When we finally return to the continent, Mali has been absorbed into Africa, a concept that no one on the African continent held on to at that time. The individual kingdoms begin to lose their identities, in the same way that the modern study of history has stolen Egypt and its rich history from the African continent, instead placing it within the context of the Middle East. At this moment, the Europeans are now, quote-unquote, discovering Africa as they begin to explore the continent. No longer do we talk about the great empires, even though Mali is just a few decades removed from its golden age. The subject is taught so quickly that it's easy for students to fill in some blanks that are left to their imagination. If you had to quickly summarize the colonial era, you would probably write, due to their modern abilities and thought, the Europeans were able to easily gain a foothold in Africa and began to trade slaves. Today's modern-day understanding of the triangular trade appropriately teaches students that the Africans were participants in this trade of human commodities. But it doesn't take time to explain why. In fact, the search for the answer of why is the reason that I began this journey of historical discovery. After the students have just been introduced to the discovery and subjugation of the African people, the American teacher then reveals the obvious, that the theft of society's strongest and brightest devastated Africa, before administering an exam and then returning back to Europe to discuss in depth the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution. Teaching all of this in quick succession suggests to the audience that the Europeans were more advanced, more sophisticated, and more capable than their African peers. In fact, that way of thinking suggests that the Africans were not even peers at all. From this vantage point, it's only a quick jump to racist ideas that include celebrated Scottish philosopher David Hume's thought that I am apt to suspect that Africans, and in general all other species of men, to be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was any civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent in action or speculation. The coup d'etat against African history by teachers comes in one final snapshot unit, returning to what is known by many as the Dark Continent for a unit on colonization. Today's history teachers are superb at teaching the horrors of colonization, but I'm not sure that we have done enough to lay the groundwork to dismantle the original justifications used by the colonizers. The institution of slavery did untold amounts of damage to the African continent. But American history teachers typically abandon Africa when the slavers leave the continent's shores. They shift their focus back to the plight of slaves in America and never properly wrap up what happens to the continent after the majority of whites leave. To be sure, there are good intentions here. Discussing one of our original sins in order to set up future teachings regarding the Civil War are important parts to the story of America's past. But that past is directly connected to Africa, and far too few teachers spare more than a moment or two to discuss what happened after Europe and the Americas ended the slave trade. Spoiler alert for those who have the same gaps in their education that I had, slavery does not end when the whites stopped their participation. Once again, we are presented with an instance of individuals undeservedly patting themselves on the back and believing that the job is done. African states continued the practice of slavery because the entirety of their civilization had been built around it. The carpet was not just pulled out from underneath them. Their foundation collapsed. The chaos that ensued from the ending of the transatlantic slave trade, on top of the absurd damage that the selective depopulation of their world did, led Europeans to reason that their actions to colonize Africa were in fact moral acts. It allowed them to wrongly claim that they were rescuing the people, rather than subjugating them once again, this time in a prison within their own lands. Through this series, I will attempt to fill in the gaps that traditional American education has produced. I say attempt because the amount of African history that needs to be understood to become an expert on this subject is unreasonable to cover for anyone that does not desire making a career out of this study. I hope that you're intrigued enough to wander with me on a journey to discover some of the history that we have disregarded. African history has been left in the dark for too many of us. Truly understanding these events can help put into context so much of what is going on, not just in Africa today, but what is happening within our own backyards. The concept of slavery has been practiced since the dawn of civilization. In fact, ancient Sumer, the birthplace of civilization itself, was economically dependent upon slavery. Hammurabi's Code of Laws shows that de jure, or legal slavery, was an early innovation of state power. The ancient Greeks, which represent the beginnings of European civilization, regularly traded in slaves. The Romans and the Egyptians had an affinity for slaves, and both played a major role in the history of the enslavement of the Jewish peoples. It was Rome who established direct commercial ties with Africa in order to facilitate a number of their gladiatorial games, as well as enslavement that kept their economy afloat. While the Eastern Hemisphere did not adopt the peculiar institution as quickly, we know that the Qin dynasty of China dealt in slaves as early as 221 BC. Finally, to illustrate my point, the Aztecs instituted slavery for important religious rituals, including human sacrifice, while the Mayans enslaved those that fell into debt. Thus, no one civilization deserves the blame for slavery, as all civilizations across the continents each independently instituted systems of enslavement. It seems as though the horrible practice is just part of our nature. Without a clear starting point, it becomes easier to define the term than to trace its history. The description that needs to be at the forefront of any discussion regarding slavery is social death. Individuals that were compelled into slavery went through a devastating process that resulted in the severing of all social ties to their former lives. They were born anew to a foreign world. There remains a vivid association in Africa between slavery and cannibalism, as individuals taken by the slave trade were devoured and never seen or heard from again. In Congo, the connection between the two concepts is quite literal, as the word kinkode represents the words which encompass the concepts of sorcery and cannibalism. These local languages are quite descriptive, as one imagines they would need to be in order to have their entire history passed down by storytellers. The root of the word kinkode is the African concept of greed. That concept is the idea that unites the concept of slavery across eras and across lands. There was no uniform use for slaves in the ancient world. Therefore, you cannot define a slave by mere mention of the tasks or jobs that they performed. While agricultural labor was common in the Americas, other civilizations utilized slaves to perform a wide variety of jobs that included skilled labor and domestic work. Many civilizations empowered their slaves to perform the roles of soldiers. They served as advisors to kings, and they were tax collectors. But even when the work wasn't punitive, the individuals serving these roles did so against their will. Perhaps the best way to understand slavery is to think of it as being comprised of a bundle of traits. First, as part of their social death, the slaves were made devoid of all kinship ties. Their outsider status meant that they were not socially, morally, or politically members of the community. The Middle Passage during the transatlantic slave trade served this purpose, but Africans had codified the process even earlier. They would transport a captured individual as far from their home community as they could. Even a short distance can feel disorienting in Africa due to its diverse geography and the existence of thousands of local languages. Slaves were delivered to their new owners in a geographically disoriented state, unable to speak or understand the language, and devoid of anyone who desired to assist them. In fact, the price and value of a slave increased in proportion to the distance from his or her native lands. This travel turned the enslaved into absolute outsiders who possessed no rights or social identity of their own. This in turn forced them to turn to the only social ties that existed for them, which was their relationship to their master. The second trait within the bundle is violence. To impart the fact that they were property, violence was inflicted upon every decision that a slave had to make. The violence began at the beginning of every slave's journey. In Africa, as well as many other civilizations, slaves were typically produced through systems of violence, most commonly from war or kidnapping. Acts of cruelty would serve to reinforce their status as property, constantly reminding them of the powerlessness of their situation. They could have treated these men and women as valued workers, but even the act of going to the bathroom was controlled by the slavers. And being forced to publicly humiliate yourself by defecating on oneself began the process of dehumanization. The distance traveled separated the individual from their known world. It also served to destroy the man in order to deliver a slave. While slaves were not always beaten, the possibility always existed for them. A chronicler defined the concept of African slavery in the following way. A slave is a man who will do as he is told. If you send him to draw palm wine in the rain, he goes. You call him brother, age mate, put your arm around his neck, give him palm wine and meat, so he is happy. He thinks you love him. Then, when your mother's brother dies, you kill him. It is likely that most slaves knew the possibility of sudden death always loomed on the horizon. Enslaved Roman gladiators took a literal oath agreeing to be burned, stabbed, and buried at any whim of their master. They did so in part to entertain the Roman mob, but more pertinent to those who fed them, they were there to make others money. The concept of slavery is directly tied to the concept of wealth generation. This is the third bundled trait. Discarding a slave meant that an owner would take an economic loss. That, and not the generosity of their persecutors, was what usually kept those that were enslaved breathing. A slave was only a slave while they could produce income. Failure to work meant that the costs outweighed the benefits, and the individual were summarily murdered. If you search your recollections of what you learned about slavery, there are no images of elderly men or women who remain in captivity till they naturally pass away. In fact, Howard French reminds us that the average lifespan of an American slave on a plantation was 7 years of work. In Africa and the Americas, slave status was hereditary, meaning that you passed your status down to your children. Research strongly indicates that, for this reason, slaves went to great lengths to not produce children. Their lives and decisions were understandably guided by the PTSD and other mental disorders that resulted from the violence inherent to their captivity. It is impossible to know the actual figures, but one suspects that many of the children born into slavery were products of violence in the form of rape by masters, rather than a consensual relationship between two slaves. The dishonor and shame that came with sexualized violence was just part of the daily dehumanization that occurred for those unfortunate enough to become caught in the vortex of violence at the center of the institution of slavery. Slaves were regularly required to go naked, given insulting nicknames. They were branded, ritually humiliated, and treated as animals. It didn't end with their life. Rather than being buried upon their death, their bodies were left for wild scavengers to feast upon. Historian Thomas Cooper referred to this practice of dehumanization as a game where owners would continually test the boundaries of the unwritten terms of servitude by all parties. What was different in the transatlantic era was the introduction of high-density chattel slavery. Before the trading of African slaves became a global industry, African tribes regularly practiced low-density forms of slavery. While not rare, this meant that slavery was not a common daily aspect in the lives of most Africans. As we highlighted before, social death was a part of the enslavement process. Cutting the individual off from all systems of familiarity made enslavement seem palatable to those involved. Since the slave was an other who had no one else to care for them, a dominant parent-child type relationship between slave and owner made sense. He or she was not one of your community, so you could justify some of the mental, physical, and spiritual costs, particularly if the individual had been captured in a war. One might even be able to convince themselves that they deserved this punishment. Xenophobia, or fear of the other, still exists today by feeding off of these same rationalizations. But social death is not the same as physical death. Gradually, through their forced labor and interactions with their new community, in this system of African low-density enslavement, slaves would make new social and emotional connections. Resurrections from social death were regular occurrences in Africa, and once they came about, slaves were typically freed to become members of the society in full. This regularly happened via marriage to a freed member of the society. In that way, African enslavement before the advent of the triangular trade became a form of purgatory, while the trip across the Atlantic was a one-way ticket to damnation. At first glance, this seems like an impossible case of Stockholm Syndrome, but the group holding the slave was oftentimes far removed from the group that violently enslaved them in the first place. A captured African would typically change hands 4 to 6 times from capture to final sale. Lost and unable to return home after being physically separated from your world meant that even if you wanted to return, you wouldn't be able to find your homeland if you tried. Leaving the safety of your new community, a community that had socially resurrected you, would only leave you vulnerable to once again being captured by a slaver, starting the act of social death anew. Chattel slavery is a form of high-density slavery that became common in the era of the transatlantic slave trade. We were not the first to practice it, however, as civilizations such as the Spartans were famous for allowing themselves to become outnumbered by their slaves. Let's examine the high-density aspect. Slaves were purchased to increase production. The economic principles behind this justification are sound. Companies grow when they can produce more. Achieving profit allows for reinvestment and expansion of your business, which in turn manifests more profit. Labor is one of, if not the key factor in this process. Any business owner will tell you that finding the right people are vital to your business's success. We understand that profit motives drive most human beings, and we therefore can utilize economic incentives to maximize the productivity of our workers. Labor capital costs, however, are one of the largest expenses for a business. This is part of why we see so much automation in today's world. While the upfront cost for AI or physical machines is expensive, you don't have to pay the machines an hourly wage or healthcare costs. Whether it is at the Target self-checkout line or an automated toll booth, machines save businesses money over the long run. Slavery operated on the exact same business principles. High upfront costs, but besides room and board, there were no hourly wages. The evidence that exists is crystal clear that African slaves worked harder and were more productive than the typical worker that they replaced. Historian Ray Kia's economic analysis found that up until 1550, a slave was able to reproduce his or her market price in about 1.5 months of work. His assessment comes from the Gold Coast of Africa and assumes that a slave can produce 48 dambas of gold per day. That means that the profit from owning one slave would pay for the purchase of 4 or 5 new slaves over the course of the next year. The peculiar institution therefore reproduced itself, both literally and metaphorically. The profits allowed for the acquisition of more labor capital, which in turn fueled business expansion. The acquisition of multiple slaves also occasionally happened to produce babies, who would in turn become future unpaid slave laborers. Looking at the practice of slavery through a purely economic lens allowed for the other aspect that defines chattel slavery in the transatlantic era, specifically the notion that chattel means that slaves were less than human. Typically, this is represented in the perspective that they were property. there's a major divergence within the West African slave trade once the Americas got involved in slavery. Namely, that slavery became racialized. Throughout history, empires could care less which race their slaves belonged to. The Greeks and other civilizations were perfectly content to enslave their own if economic debts needed to be paid off. As we have already hinted at, prior to the triangular trade, the different kingdoms of Africa gathered slaves from other tribes. Please understand that we're going to run through some terms loosely when we're talking about Africa's peoples. Ethnicity is a relatively newer concept that was not indigenous to the continent of Africa. In fact, it was imposed upon the Africans by Europeans during colonialism. Africans dealt in kinship rather than ethnicity. The difference is that I can switch and become a part of their kinship community. It is impossible, however, to switch one's ethnicity. Our way of understanding differences, as well as a belief in the permanency of those differences, are not native to Africa. While there are formal states that develop in Africa, they oftentimes did not view themselves as constrained by physical borders like European states. Once the transatlantic trade began, the concepts of slavery soon became conflated racially. This conflation begins an era of racist justifications for the enslavement of nearly the entire continent of Africa. It made them the sacrificial lamb on the altar to the economic gods. It also resulted in further dehumanization. Before the racialization of slavery, anyone was at risk of becoming enslaved. A few bad business decisions could find you enslaved for your debts. If your side lost the battle, you as a soldier, as well as your wife and any children that you were protecting, could find themselves shackled and meeting their new master. Everyone could imagine a slightly different version of their reality, where they were thrust into the shoes of their captives. Once it became racial in nature, however, everyone that was born white was secure in the fact that no matter what, they would never have to be in the African's shoes. They never have to even imagine it. It locks in an unnatural hierarchy. The inability to sympathize with their slaves allowed some of the worst violence to occur, unchecked by one's own conscience. For metaphor purposes only, if slavery was a video game, then the transatlantic slave trade was the ultimate villain at the end. Remember that while there's not an exact definition, slavery is a bundle of traits. The Middle Passage transported the victims to a land across an ocean, a land where the only individuals that looked like you were also enslaved. Among the others enslaved with you, there was no common language, religion, or chance to return home. The foods, clothes, and climate were all radically different. The racialized ideas of chattel slavery being shipped to the New World were more than just social death. It was a fate far worse than death. It was a prison sentence with no chance of an early release. During the Middle Passage, which is among the most horrifying experiences throughout all of human existence, violence was continuous. English surgeon Alexander Falconbridge wrote in the 1780s about the River Bonny, a portion of the Niger Delta, which served as a major slave trading zone during the 18th century. Falconbridge tells us that the water abounds with sharks of a very large size, which are often seen in almost incredible numbers about the slave ships, devouring with great dispatch the dead bodies of the Africans as they are thrown overboard. As horrific as the Middle Passage was, its story neglects the violence that occurred before the indentured ever reached the slave ships. We will examine that violence, as well as the unique symbiotic relationship between the practice of slavery and the growth of the African state, as well as the subsequent rise of the African big men in our next episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowry@gmail.com. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the show description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.